The dust of San Amaro was a fine red powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder that the desert was patient and would one day reclaim the town. It coated the unpainted planks of the general store, filled the cracks in the boardwalk, and gave the water in the horse troughs a pinkish tint. The year was 1880-something, and the town was a raw nerve ending on the vast, sun-baked skin of the Arizona-New Mexico territory. A new silver vein had been struck in the hills, and the railroad was pushing its iron spine west, bringing with it the kind of men who saw the land not for what it was, but for what could be torn out of it. With them came the threat of drought, the constant whisper of sandstorms, and a measles outbreak that clung to the settlement like a fever. Camila Alvarez felt the grit on her teeth as she swept the floor of her father's old clinic. At 22, she carried the weight of his legacy in the straightness of her back and the careful way she folded a clean linen bandage. Her father, a doctor from Mexico, had taught her that healing was a form of prayer, a quiet act of dignity in a world full of noise and violence. He was gone now, taken by a horse's kick, leaving her with his books, his instruments, and a small adobe house that smelled of carbolic soap and dried herbs. She was not a doctor, not officially, but she served as the town's midwife and patched up the wounds left by whiskey, knives, and foolishness. She worked with a focused calm, her hands steady as she ground herbs with a mortar and pestle. A promise she had made to her mother on her deathbed echoed in the quiet moments of her life. She was to keep herself whole, to guard her heart until she found a man who understood that life. All life was sacred. It was a promise that had become a wall, keeping her safe from the rough hands and easy promises of the men who passed through San Amaro. She feared the finality of a ring and a vow more than she feared the flash of a pistol. Her purpose was here, in this room, with the clean scent of her remedies and the trust of the people who sought her help. A roll of white bandage sat on her workbench, a stark symbol of her trade. It was a tool to mend what was broken, to bind and protect. Miles away, where the red mesas clawed at an endless blue sky, Ashki Nez rode his gray horse, Smoke. The land spoke a language he understood better than the clipped English of the white men or the flowing Spanish of the Mexicans. He was Navajo, a warrior by blood and a hunter by necessity. His silence a shield in a world that had grown too loud. His eyes, the color of flint, missed nothing. He saw the way a hawk circled, a sign of water nearby. He noted the tracks of a shod horse, too heavy to be a traveler, likely one of Amon Pike's men. Pike was a name that tasted like ash in Ashki's mouth. The man owned the new silver mine and held the railroad contracts, his ambition as vast and empty as the desert itself. He wanted the valley, the whole of it, and the red stream that was the lifeblood of Ashki's people. To Pike, the Navajo were merely an obstacle, like a stubborn rock that needed to be blasted out of the way. Ashki carried a single eagle feather tied into his long black hair, a connection to the sky, to freedom, to the world Pike could never own. But his quest was more personal than a fight over water. His younger sister, Little Sparrow, was gone. She had been caught in the path of a raid on a railroad payroll transport, a piece of violence that had spilled over and stained his family's life. He was hunting for more than just a killer. He was hunting for a ghost, a reason, a piece of justice in a land where the law was whatever a man with a gun said it was. He sometimes hired himself out as a cowboy, breaking horses, his quiet strength making him valuable to ranchers who cared more for skill than for the color of a man's skin. It allowed him to listen, to drift through the white man's world, his true purpose hidden behind his calm demeanor. In San Amaro, the law had a face. Lieutenant Harrow of the United States Cavalry was a man who believed civilization arrived at the point of a bayonet. He spoke of order and progress, but his actions were always aligned with the interests of Amon Pike. The two men were two sides of the same coin, one promising prosperity, the other peace, and both intending to sweep the native people from the land. A new arrival in town, a man named Hyde, completed the picture. He was a Pinkerton detective, his eyes cold and his questions sharp. A bloodhound hired by Pike to protect his investments and enforce his will. Camilla finished her work and looked out the window. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on the dusty street. She saw two of Pike's miners stumble out of the saloon, their laughter coarse. The town was a fragile ecosystem, a mix of Anglo settlers, Mexican families, and a few Chinese laborers who worked on the railroad. They lived in a state of wary tolerance, bound by shared hardship but divided by suspicion and the old, tired prejudices that men carried with them like baggage. Camilla felt the divisions keenly. Some saw her as a healer, a blessing. Others whispered about the Mexican girl who knew too much about herbs and not enough about her place. Her dignity, her dignidad, was a quiet fire she tended within herself. It was all she had. Ashki dismounted by the red stream, letting Smoke drink. The water was cool and clear, but the clay of the riverbed gave it a deep, rusty color, as if the land itself were bleeding. This water was life. He knelt, cupping some in his hands, the coolness a relief against his skin. He remembered little Sparrow laughing as she splashed in this very stream. The memory was a sharp pain, a wound that would not close. He would find the man responsible. He would follow the trail until it ended. No matter where it led, the law of his people demanded it. Justice was not a thing written in a book. It was a balance that had to be restored. Back in the clinic, Camilla organized her supplies. She stacked the rolls of white medical bandages, each one a promise of healing. She thought of the promise she had made to her mother, a vow of the heart. Love, she believed, should be like her work. It should be about mending, not breaking. It should be a gentle hand on a fevered brow, a steady presence in a time of pain. It should be about choosing to stay when everything inside you screamed to run. She had not yet met a man who seemed to understand that. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to change. The brilliant blue faded to a hazy, yellowish gray. The wind picked up, rattling the loose pane in Camilla's window and sending little dust devils dancing down the street. A sandstorm was coming. The people of San Amaro knew the signs. They began to shutter their windows and secure their livestock. The air grew thick, heavy with the taste of grit and the feeling of something inevitable approaching. Ashki saw it too. From his vantage point in the low hills, he watched the massive wall of sand and dust building on the horizon. It was a force of nature, indifferent and absolute, a power that could strip a man to the bone. He led Smoke to the shelter of a rock overhang, his movements calm and efficient. He would wait it out. The desert taught patience above all else. As he settled in, a sound reached him, carried on the rising wind. It was faint, high, and mournful, a sound that did not belong to the natural world. It was the whistle of a train, a cry of iron and steam cutting through the silence of the ancient land. It was the sound of the world changing, a sound that promised both connection and conflict, a future that was rushing toward them all, as unstoppable as the coming storm. The night air in the saloon was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and unlit cigars. A traveling piano player hammered out a tune that was more noise than music, a frantic soundtrack for the boisterous laughter of miners and cowboys. The celebration, fueled by a fresh delivery of liquor, was teetering on the edge of chaos. It tipped over when a young cowboy, his face flushed with drink and bravado, decided to prove he could shoot the pips out of a playing card tossed in the air. His first shot shattered a bottle behind the bar. His second went wild, and a man at a nearby table grunted, clutching his shoulder as he slumped to the floor. Panic erupted. Men scrambled for cover, overturning tables and chairs. Before the smoke had even cleared, Camilla Alvarez was pushing through the swinging doors, her medical bag in hand. She had heard the shots from her clinic down the street and ran toward the danger without a second thought. She knelt beside the wounded man, a railroad worker she recognized. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The bullet had gone clean through, but he was losing blood fast. as she pressed a wad of clean linen against the wound. Her fingers brushed against something hard tucked into the man's vest. It was a stiff piece of leather, like the cover of a small book. Thinking it was just part of his belongings that had come loose, and needing it out of her way, she picked it up and quickly slipped it into an outer pocket of her own bag. Just as she was wrapping a bandage around the man's shoulder, a shadow fell over them. The Pinkerton detective, Hyde, stood there, his cold eyes taking in the scene. His gaze locked onto her, then flickered to the spot where the leather cover had been. He said nothing, but a flicker of accusation tightened his thin lips. He looked at her as if she were a thief, not a healer. The implication hung in the air, unseen but heavy. She ignored him, focusing on her patient, telling the saloon owner, Don Mateo, to help her carry the man to her clinic. The next morning, as the town swept up the broken glass and patched the new bullet holes, a different kind of trouble arrived at Camilla's door. A tall Navajo man stood on her porch, his face a mask of stoic desperation. In his arms, he held a small child, a girl wrapped in a blanket, her body limp with fever. It was Ashki Nez. Their eyes met for the first time. Camilla saw a father's fear beneath the warrior's calm. Ashki saw a woman whose gaze was direct and unafraid, her hands already reaching for the child. There was a moment of silent assessment, a flicker of guarded respect between two people from different worlds, united by the universal urgency of a child's suffering. She led him inside, taking the girl from his arms. The child was burning up. Camilla worked swiftly, sponging the girl's face with cool water and preparing a tincture of willow bark. Ashki stood by the wall, a silent, watchful presence. He observed the clean, orderly room, the rows of glass jars filled with herbs, the shining medical instruments. When Camilla finally had the fever down enough for the child to sleep, he stepped forward. He did not have money, but he placed a small deerskin pouch on the table. It was filled with ground juniper and other herbs he had gathered, plants with powerful healing properties that were rare in this part of the desert. It was a payment of respect, knowledge for knowledge. As he left, Camilla overheard the whispers from across the street. Two women, their faces pinched with disapproval, were talking by the general store. Treating an Indian, one said, her voice dripping with scorn. She should know better. It is not proper. Camilla's back stiffened. She closed her door, shutting out their voices. Her father's words came back to her. We do not ask who a person is. Camilla, we only ask where they hurt. The life of the child sleeping in her cot was all that mattered. Later that day, news spread through town like a brush fire. Amon Pike's men claimed a Navajo raiding party had set fire to a crucial water pump station near the new railway line. Pike was furious. Calling the act sabotage, Lieutenant Harrow responded immediately, his voice ringing with authority in the dusty street. He declared the act a clear sign of native aggression and vowed to dismantle any and all unauthorized encampments in the valley to ensure the safety of the settlers. It was the excuse he and Pike had been waiting for. The threat became personal that afternoon. Hyde appeared at her clinic again, this time alone. He closed the door behind him, his presence sucking the warmth from the small room. I will be direct, Miss Alvarez, he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. The man you treated last night was carrying a ledger. You took it. I want it back. Camilla stared at him, completely bewildered. A ledger? I took nothing but a bullet out of his shoulder. I am a healer, not a thief. Do not play games with me, Hyde hissed, taking a step closer. Pike's private accounts. It was in a small book. Give it to me, and you can continue your little business here. Refuse, and I will have Lieutenant Harrow declare this clinic a public menace and shut it down for good. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. She had no book. She had no idea what he was talking about. She searched her memory of the chaotic saloon, the blood, the man's gasping breaths. Nothing. She could only shake her head, her voice small but firm. I do not have what you are looking for. Hyde gave her a look of pure contempt before turning and leaving as silently as he had arrived. That evening, Ashki returned. He brought a small offering of roasted corn and dried meat, his silent way of giving thanks. The child's fever had not broken, but she was resting. He watched Camilla as she checked on the girl, her touch gentle, her voice a soft murmur. His gaze fell upon the medical bag sitting on a chair, the bag her mother had stitched for her years ago. He saw a corner of dark, tooled leather sticking out of the side pocket. He pointed. "What is that?" Camilla looked, her brow furrowed in confusion. She pulled it out. It was the piece of leather she had hastily tucked away in the saloon. It was not a full book, but the stiff front cover torn from its binding. Ashki took it from her, his expression hardening as he ran a thumb over the intricate pattern stamped into the leather. It was a symbol he recognized, a stylized P used by Pike's Mining Company. He had seen a foreman carrying a full ledger with the same cover, the same design. He understood everything in an instant. Hyde was not just a detective. He was Pike's cleaner, sent to retrieve evidence that could ruin him, evidence that was now, by a twist of fate, in their hands. He explained to Camilla that this cover was likely the key to a record of bribes, illegal land grabs, and perhaps a clue to who was behind the raid that had taken his sister's life. Camilla felt the world shift beneath her feet. She was trapped. On one side was Hyde, with the threat of the law and the power of Pike behind him. On the other was this quiet, intense man, a stranger, asking her to believe him. She looked from the determined set of Ashki's jaw to the small, sleeping child in the cot. This little girl, innocent and sick, was caught in the middle of it all. Choosing a side was no longer possible. She was already on one, trusting the evidence of her own eyes, the gentleness of this man with a sick child, over the cold threats of the detective. She made her decision. She pushed the ledger cover back into Ashki's hand. "Take it," she said. "Find the truth." But the child was still too weak. To move her now would be a death sentence. Ashki knew he could not stay in San Amaro. Pike's men or Harrow's soldiers would be looking for him soon enough. He was a known warrior, an easy target to blame for the fire at the pump station. "I must leave tonight," he said. Camilla looked at her patient. Her duty was clear. "I will come with you," she said, the word surprising even herself. "Just for a few days, until her fever breaks. She cannot travel without care." And so, as the sandstorm finally descended upon the town, whipping red dust into a blinding frenzy that erased the world, they slipped out of San Amaro. Camilla rode a sturdy mule borrowed from the church stables, the sick child wrapped securely against her chest. Ashki led the way on his gray horse. Smoke. The wind howled around them, covering their tracks the moment they were made. The steady, rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves against the dry earth was a defiant drum, a sound of rebellion against the encroaching darkness, a march toward an unknown and dangerous dawn. The sandstorm was a living thing, a screaming red beast that swallowed the sky. It clawed at them with granular teeth, trying to strip the flesh from their bones. Camilla hunched over on her mule, shielding the sick child with her own body. A wet cloth held fast over the little girl's mouth and nose. She could see nothing but the swirling vortex of ochre dust and the faint, broad outline of Ashki on his horse just ahead. He was their anchor in the chaos, a silent, unmoving point of certainty in a world that had come undone. The wind shrieked, erasing their tracks, erasing the world, leaving them utterly alone in its violent heart. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a world scoured clean and rearranged. The dawn broke over a landscape of desolate beauty. The dunes shifted into new and unfamiliar shapes under a sky washed pale. The sun climbed, and with it came the heat, a dry, oppressive weight that leached the moisture from their bodies. Their water was nearly gone. By midday, Camilla's tongue felt thick in her mouth, and the child, Yellow Feather, whimpered with a thirst her fever only intensified. Ashki stopped smoke, his eyes scanning the barren ground. To Camila, it was a uniform expanse of baked earth and rock. To him, it was a map. He dismounted and walked slowly, his gaze fixed on the subtle language of the land. He pointed to a patch of pale green weeds, their leaves stubbornly clinging to life. "These roots seek deep," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. "They drink what we cannot see." He followed the almost invisible line of their growth to a shallow depression between two low hills. There, he began to dig with his hands and a flat rock, his movements patient and rhythmic. Camila watched, her skepticism warring with a desperate hope. After several feet, the sand grew dark and cool. A moment later, a small, muddy puddle of water seeped into the bottom of the hole. It was not much, but it was life. He showed her how to line the hole with small pebbles to help filter the water as it collected. The slow, tedious work of survival, the shared focus on this single, vital task, forged a silent bond between them, a connection stronger than any spoken words. That night, they made a small, smokeless fire with dried greasewood in the shelter of a rock overhang. Yellow Feather, her fever finally showing signs of receding, slept soundly. The stars emerged, a brilliant, cold scatter of diamonds on black velvet. So close it felt as if she could reach out and touch them. The immense silence of the desert pressed in on them. "You are not like the other women in the town," Ashki said, breaking the quiet. He was looking at the fire, but she knew he was seeing her. Camila managed a small, tired smile. "Is that good or bad?" "It is different," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. She looked up at the stars, the same stars her father had taught her to navigate by. "My mother wanted me to marry a good man, have a house full of children," she said, her voice soft. "I think I am afraid of that." She paused, finding the right words for a truth she rarely spoke aloud. "I am more afraid of a wedding ring than I am of a gunshot. A gunshot is over quickly. A ring is forever. I want to be useful first. I want my life to mean something, to be my own, before I give part of it to someone else." Ashki was silent for a long time, watching the flames dance. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet understanding. To be your own is a strong path to walk. They traveled for 2 more days, moving through a landscape of towering mesas and deep canyons. On the 3rd morning, they came upon the remains of the Navajo camp. The stench of ash and ruin hung heavy in the still air. Tents were burned to their frames, pottery was shattered, and the ground was littered with the refuse of violent destruction. Ashki moved through the devastation, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Camila stayed with the child, her heart aching at the senselessness of it all. Ashki knelt by the ashes of what had been a large fire. He pointed to the ground. In the soft dust, preserved by the dry air, were the distinct impressions of military issue boots. They were everywhere, mixed with the fainter tracks of his people's moccasins. The official story of a Navajo raid was a lie, written here in the dirt for anyone to see. As he rose, a glint of silver caught his eye. He reached down and picked up a small, tarnished bracelet, its delicate stamped pattern familiar to him. It was his sister's. Little Sparrow had never taken it off. He closed his fist around it, the metal cool and solid against his palm. It was the only part of her he had left. It was proof. They knew they were being followed. Ashki could feel it, a prickling on the back of his neck, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. He chose their path carefully, heading for a narrow pass through a jumble of red rock spires. It offered the best cover, but it was also a perfect place for an ambush. It came without warning. As they rounded a sharp bend, the air was split by the sharp crack of a rifle, and the rocks above them exploded. Camila screamed as a cascade of stones and dust rained down. Ashki reacted instantly, shoving her and the mule hard against the canyon wall as a larger boulder crashed down where they had been a second before. He drew his pistol, firing 2 quick shots toward the rim of the canyon, not to hit, but to force the attackers to keep their heads down. He grabbed the mule's lead rope. "Go!" he yelled, slapping the animal's flank. "Do not stop!" Camilla clung to the saddle horn, her heart hammering against her ribs as the mule scrambled forward. Another shot rang out, and she felt a searing pain as a bullet grazed her arm. Then she heard Ashki cry out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. She looked back and saw him stumble, his hand clutching his shoulder, blood already staining his shirt. 2 men were climbing down from the rocks. Hyde and another rifleman. Ashki raised his pistol again, his aim steady despite his wound, and fired. The second man grunted and fell back, clutching his leg. Hyde dragged his wounded partner back into cover, and the pass fell silent again. They did not stop until they were miles away, hidden deep in a small, wooded canyon with a trickle of a stream running through it. Only then did Camilla allow herself to see the extent of Ashki's injury. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his left shoulder, a deep and ragged wound. "Sit," she ordered, her voice shaking but firm. Her fear was gone, replaced by the cool competence of a healer. She tore a strip from her petticoat and began to clean the wound with water from the stream. Ashki watched her, his face pale and tight with pain, but he did not make a sound. She took out her medical bag, her hands moving with purpose. "This will hurt," she said, holding a small flask of whiskey. "It is all I have for the pain." He shook his head. "No, I must keep my mind clear." She looked at him, at the raw courage in his flint-like eyes, and felt a wave of admiration. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound of debris, her touch as gentle as she could make it. As she stitched the torn flesh back together with a needle and gut, she spoke quietly, more to herself than to him. "My mother used to say that no person is refuse in the eyes of God," she whispered. "Every life has value. To heal a wound is to honor that. It does not matter whose life it is." When she was finished, she had wrapped his shoulder tightly with a clean white bandage. A rumor, carried on the wind like a poisonous seed, had already reached the distant traveler Ashki had briefly spoken with a day before. The story had twisted and changed, as stories do. In San Amaro, they were saying the Mexican healer had run off with a savage, a traitor to her own people. Lieutenant Harrow, seizing the opportunity, had officially issued a warrant for her arrest, aiding a fugitive. They called it. She was no longer just a healer. She was an outlaw. As night fell, Ashki, weak but resolute, led them to the top of a wide mesa that overlooked the vast plains. He needed to see the lay of the land, to plan their next move. From that high vantage point, the world spread out below them. In the distance, a thin black line cut across the landscape, the railroad, and moving along it was something new, a train, longer than any she had ever seen. Its cars dark and uniform. At the front and back were flatbeds carrying cannons and soldiers, their rifles glinting in the last rays of the setting sun. It was a war machine, a rolling fortress of iron and steel. As they watched it slide across the desert floor, Ashki's horse, Smoke, lifted his head and let out a long, mournful whinny. The sound echoed across the silent mesa, a lonely, chilling cry that spoke of danger and loss, a premonition of the hard road that lay ahead. Yellow Feather's fever had returned, a stubborn fire that the last of Camilla's willow bark could not quench. They needed more potent medicine, quinine and other supplies that could only be found in San Amaro. Returning was a risk Ashki did not want to take, but the child's shallow breathing left them no choice. They rode under the cover of a moonless night, slipping into the sleeping town like ghosts. The San Amaro they returned to was not the one they had left. It was a town that had chosen sides. As Camilla moved through the pre-dawn shadows toward the church, a door opened and an old man she had once treated for a rattlesnake bite spat on the ground where she was about to step. He said nothing, but his eyes were filled with a cold hatred. Minutes later, as she huddled in the darkness behind the livery, another shadow approached. It was Martha, the baker's wife, whose newborn son Camilla had saved during a difficult birth. She pressed a warm loaf of bread into Camilla's hands, and a small, Heavy pouch. For the journey, she whispered, her voice thick with fear. God keep you, child? The town was a fractured mirror, reflecting both its ugliest fears and its quietest acts of courage. Camilla found the Mother Superior in the sacristy, preparing for morning mass. The old nun's face, a road map of wrinkles, showed no surprise, only a deep and weary concern. Lieutenant Harrow's men were here, she said, her voice a low murmur. They searched your clinic from top to bottom. They took some of your books, your papers. She led Camilla to a small pantry behind the altar, its shelves filled with communion wine and candles. Behind a stack of linens, she had hidden a wooden box. It was filled with the herbs, tinctures, and quinine Camilla needed. The law of man is a fickle thing, my daughter, the Mother Superior said, placing a hand on Camilla's arm. Do not forget there is a higher one. While Camilla gathered her supplies, Eamon Pike was holding court at the town hall, before the hastily assembled town council. He unrolled a large, professionally drawn map. It showed San Amaro not as it was, but as it could be. It depicted new streets, a larger rail depot, and a series of irrigation channels diverting water from the Red Stream. Progress, Pike said, his voice smooth and confident. Prosperity for every man and woman in this town. He painted a picture of a verdant future, of fields and orchards blooming in the desert, all powered by the water he planned to seize. He spoke of the Navajo as a temporary nuisance, a primitive obstacle to a brighter future. Seduced by the promise of profit, the council members nodded in agreement. The Red Stream, the lifeblood of Ashki's people, was signed away with a few strokes of a pen. Later that afternoon, a piercing whistle from the silver mine signaled an accident. A pulley had snapped on one of the main lift cages, sending a car full of rock and a single miner plummeting to the bottom of the shaft. They brought the man, what was left of him, to Camilla's clinic, knowing she was the only one who might be able to help. He was a young man named Samuel, his body broken beyond any hope of mending. He was drowning in his own blood, his time measured in agonizing breaths. Camilla did what she could to ease his pain, wiping his brow and holding his hand. In a moment of clarity, his eyes focused on her. The book, he rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. Pike's book. He struggled to reach inside his torn shirt, his fingers fumbling. I kept the other half. He pulled out a filthy piece of leather, the back cover of a small ledger, its binding ripped away. He paid us for the raid, on the train, to blame the Indians. His confession was a desperate, gurgling whisper. He pressed the leather cover into her hand. Tell my wife, I am sorry. And then he was gone. Camilla stared at the piece of leather in her hand, her blood running cold. She pulled the front cover Ashki had given her from her bag. They were a perfect match. Hyde found her just as dusk was settling, as she was washing the blood from her hands. He did not knock. He simply appeared in the doorway, his presence a chilling void. I hear you had a visitor, he said, his eyes flicking to the covered body on her cot. He stepped inside. You look like a woman who has had a very difficult day. It does not have to be this way. Give me the ledger. Miss Alvarez, both pieces. In return, I can offer you peace. The warrant will disappear. You can go back to your quiet life. Camilla dried her hands on her apron, her gaze unwavering. She thought of the dead boy on her table, of little Sparrow's silver bracelet, of Yellow Feather's fevered sleep. The peace you offer is the silence of a graveyard, she said, her voice low but clear. It is a peace built on the bones of people whose only crime was to exist in your way. I will not buy it. Hyde's face did not change, but a new coldness entered his eyes. A foolish choice, he said, and then he was gone. That night, Ashki acted. While the town was distracted by a fight in the saloon, he moved through the shadows toward Pike's office, a small building behind the mining company headquarters. He scaled a low wall and slipped through an unlocked window, silent as a ghost. He needed the official water surveys, The documents that would prove Pike's plans were based on stolen land and fraudulent claims. He found them in a locked desk drawer, which he pried open with the tip of his knife. But it was a trap. As he turned to leave, the office door burst open. Hyde stood there, a pistol in his hand, flanked by two of Pike's hired guns. "You are a long way from home, warrior," Hyde sneered. From across the street, hidden in the deep shadows of an alleyway, Camilla watched it happen. She had followed Ashki, a terrible premonition twisting in her gut. She saw the men corner him, saw the glint of their guns in the lamplight. There was no way out for him. They were going to kill him. A wave of pure, cold terror washed over her, followed by a surge of something else, something fierce and protective. On the ground beside her, left behind by a careless drunk, was a discarded pistol. Her hand closed around the wooden grip. She had never fired a gun in her life. She raised the heavy weapon with both hands, her arms shaking so violently she could barely aim. She was not aiming at any of the men. Her focus was on the large oil lamp sitting on the corner of the desk, its glass chimney glowing with a yellow light. She closed her eyes, said a prayer, and pulled the trigger. The explosion of sound and light was deafening. The bullet, wildly off course from where she had intended, struck the wall but sent a shower of plaster down onto the lamp, shattering the glass. Oil spilled and ignited instantly. A whoosh of flame that engulfed the desk and sent Hyde and his men staggering back, momentarily blinded. In that instant of chaos, Ashki dove through the still open window, clutching the stolen papers, and disappeared into the night. Camilla stood frozen in the alley, the heavy pistol still in her hands, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. She had done it. She had fired a gun at another human being. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her, so profound she thought she would be sick. She dropped the gun as if it were a hot coal. A moment later, Ashki was beside her, pulling her deeper into the shadows. He saw the look on her face, the wide, terrified eyes, the way her whole body was trembling. He put a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and grounding. "Camilla," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Look at me." She forced her gaze up to his. "You did not take a life," he said, his eyes holding hers. "You saved one." Before she could answer, a new sound split the night. It was the frantic, clanging toll of the church bell, the universal signal for a fire, for a town-wide alarm. They looked toward the center of town and saw it. A hellish orange glow was rising into the night sky, illuminating the panicked figures of people running in the streets. It was the town's grain warehouse, its entire winter supply of food, engulfed in flames. It was Pike's answer. It was his retribution. The town, already fractured and afraid, was now plunging into chaos. Amid the chaos of the burning town, Ashki pulled Camilla into the deep darkness of the church's stables. The acrid smoke of burning grain filled the air, a funeral pyre for the town's security. Panicked shouts and the clang of the fire bucket brigade provided a desperate soundtrack to their escape. Inside the stable, the air was thick with the scent of hay and horses, a small island of familiar smells in a world turned upside down. Yellow Feather was safe with the Mother Superior, but they could not stay. Under the dim light of a single, shielded lantern, Camilla laid the 2 pieces of leather on a clean horse blanket, the front cover taken from the wounded man in the saloon, and the back cover pressed into her hand by the dying miner. Samuel. She saw now that Samuel had given her more than just the cover. Tucked inside it were the remaining pages of the ledger, a thin sheaf of paper stained with his blood and the grime of the mine. With trembling fingers, she brought the 2 halves of the book together. They fit perfectly. The torn spine of the front section aligned with the ragged edge of the back, and when she closed the covers, they formed a single, complete, if battered, little book. Ashki watched her, his face grim in the flickering light. Together, they opened it. The pages were filled with a cramped, spidery script, a meticulous record of Eamon Pike's ambition. It was all there, laid out in neat columns of names and numbers. Payments to railroad officials to look the other way. Bribes to land office clerks to misfile Navajo territorial claims. A list of men who had been paid for their silence after witnessing Pike's brutal methods. It even detailed the plan to stake claims along the Red Stream, using a falsified geological survey to declare the land rich with minerals. A legal loophole to justify pushing the native people out. And near the end, a recent entry of payment distributed among several men, including Samuel, for services rendered, dated the day of the attack on the railroad payroll, the same day Little Sparrow had been killed. Then Camilla saw a name that made her breath catch in her throat, a name she knew as well as her own. Don Mateo, her godfather, the owner of the saloon, the man who had always had a kind word for her, who had patted her on the head as a child and given her candy. Beside his name was a sum of money, paid out just a week ago, with a note beside it. For information, C and a route, C and A, Camilla and Ashki. He had sold them out. The knowledge was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs, the ambush in the canyon, Hyde's uncanny ability to find her. It had all been him. The trust she had carried for him her entire life shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was a betrayal so profound, so personal, it felt worse than any bullet wound. She looked up at Ashki, her eyes wide with a pain he understood instantly. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of his own people who had been betrayed by promises from the white man's government. She had to know. She had to face him, leaving Ashki hidden with the ledger. She pulled her shawl over her head and slipped out of the stable, moving through the chaotic streets toward the saloon. The fire was mostly under control now, leaving a smoldering ruin and a deep sense of dread hanging over the town. She found Don Mateo on the boardwalk outside his saloon, directing men with a bucket. He saw her, and his face, usually so jovial, tightened with a flicker of something she now recognized as guilt. She walked straight up to him, her voice low and steady, cutting through the surrounding noise. "Don Mateo." He tried to smile, a weak, watery thing. "Camila, my child, it is good you are safe. There were terrible rumors." "I have saved so many men in your saloon, godfather," she said, her voice trembling with a contained fury. "I have stitched their wounds, set their bones, sat with them when they were dying. For how much did you sell me?" The false smile vanished from his face, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. He stammered, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. I do not know what you mean. Pike, he is a powerful man. He promised no one would be hurt." His excuses were a meaningless noise. The truth was in his eyes. Just then, 2 figures emerged from the shadows. It was Hyde, and with him, Lieutenant Harrow. "There she is," Hyde said, his voice flat and triumphant. "Miss Alvarez, you are under arrest for aiding a fugitive, conspiracy, and theft of private property." He produced a set of iron handcuffs. Camilla stood her ground. "You have no proof of anything." "I have the word of a respected town merchant," Hyde said with a thin smile, nodding toward Don Mateo, who refused to meet her gaze. "And a federal warrant." He lunged forward, grabbing her wrist and snapping one of the cold metal cuffs onto it before she could react. Suddenly, the alley beside the saloon exploded in a cloud of reddish-brown dust. Ashki appeared as if from nowhere, a small pouch in his hand. He had thrown a handful of potent, finely ground chili powder directly into the faces of Hyde and Harrow. The effect was immediate and crippling. The men choked, their eyes streaming, clawing at their faces as they gasped for air. In that moment of confusion, Ashki grabbed Camilla, pulling her with him into the alley. He used the edge of a rain barrel to smash the chain of the handcuffs, breaking her free. They plunged into the darkness, the sounds of the 2 men's agonized coughing fading behind them. They stopped in the deepest part of the alley, a narrow space between 2 buildings that smelled of garbage and stale beer. Up ahead, they could see Don Mateo staggering away, trying to lose himself in the crowd. Ashki still had his pistol in his hand. He looked from the fleeing man to Camilla. He did not need to say a word. The question hung in the air between them. Justice could be swift and final, here in the darkness. Camilla looked at the pathetic, stooped figure of her godfather, the man who had betrayed her. Her heart was a cold, hard knot of pain and anger. She thought of the pistol she had fired, the sickening feeling of its power, the horror of almost taking a life. She looked at Ashki's pistol, a tool of death, and then at her own hands, hands meant for healing. She could not. That was not the justice she was seeking. "No," she said, her voice firm. She touched his arm, the one holding the gun. "We will use the book. We will use the law. We will not become them." Ashki looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he lowered the pistol and nodded. They escaped the town again, this time heading for the hills, for the sanctuary of the Red Stream. They rested by its bank, the water whispering over the colored stones. The only sound in the quiet of the night. The moon had risen, casting a silver light on the landscape. Ashki bathed his face in the cool water, washing away the dust and tension of the night. He looked at Camilla, at the strength in her tired face. "I made a promise to myself when my sister was killed," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I swore I would never again trust a Mexican or an Anglo. I believed you were all part of the same world that took her." Camilla looked at her reflection in the dark water, at the face of a woman who was no longer the same person who had swept the floor of her clinic just days ago. "I swore a promise too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A long time ago. I swore the same thing you did, but about men." Their shared confessions hung in the quiet air, a bridge of understanding built from their separate pains. In that moment, they were not a Navajo warrior and a Mexican healer. They were just two people who had been wounded by the world, who had found in each other an unexpected and fragile trust. The next day, news reached them from a Navajo scout, in response to the granary fire, which he was publicly blaming on a savage uprising. Lieutenant Harrow had formally requested permission to impose martial law on the entire valley. Amon Pike was already delivering new rifles and crates of ammunition to the cavalry barracks. The world was shrinking, the walls closing in. They had the truth in their hands. But the men in power were preparing for a war to make sure it was never heard. Camilla knew they had only one move left. It was a gamble, a desperate appeal to a power greater than Pike's money or Harrow's guns. That afternoon, she walked out of the hills and back into San Amaro. She did not hide. She walked down the middle of the main street, her back straight, her head held high. In her hand, she carried the ledger. People stopped and stared, whispering, pointing. She ignored them all. She walked straight to the church, its adobe walls glowing in the afternoon sun. She did not pause at the entrance, but walked directly up the aisle to the altar, where Father Thomas was preparing for evening vespers. She held out the book. "Father," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent church, "I ask you to bear witness. This book contains evidence of murder and theft. I ask you to keep it safe, to seal it with the seal of the church, so that all may know its truth cannot be changed." Father Thomas looked from her earnest, determined face to the battered ledger in her hand. He looked out at the small crowd of townspeople who had followed her into the church, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. He nodded slowly, his old eyes filled with a grave understanding. He took the book. As he did, he reached up and pulled the rope for the church bell. A single, resonant chime pealed out across the town, a clear, solitary note of defiance. Then, it was silent. They found refuge in a narrow slit canyon, a place the old ones said was carved by a great serpent in the first days of the world. The rock walls rose 100 feet on either side, a natural fortress against the wind and prying eyes. A small fire of dried mesquite crackled in the center of their camp, a single point of warmth and light in the vast, enveloping darkness. The silence here was different from the silence of the open desert. It was a deep, resonant quiet, a silence that felt safe. Inni, Camilla worked by the flickering light of the fire, carefully unwrapping the bandage from Ashki's shoulder. The wound was clean, her stitches holding, but the flesh around it was bruised and angry. She cleaned it again with a cloth dipped in boiled water, her movements practiced and gentle. Ashki sat on a flat rock, his back straight, watching her. He had been a model of stoicism since the injury, but she saw the faint tightening around his eyes whenever her fingers probed a tender spot. "You are a terrible patient," she said, her voice a soft tease, designed to break the tension that had been stretched taut between them for days. "You sit there like a statue, but I can feel you flinching all the way through the stone." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "A bullet is an honest pain. It comes and goes in an instant. Your healing hurts for days? Healer. Then perhaps you should stop getting in the way of bullets," she retorted, dabbing a soothing herbal salve onto the wound. "It would save us both a great deal of trouble." She worked with an intense focus, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight played across her face, catching the stray strands of dark hair that had escaped her braid. To Ashki, she was a study in contradictions. Her hands, so gentle and sure in their work, were the same hands that had fired a pistol to save his life. Her voice, so soft and calming, was the same voice that had faced down Pike's hired man with unwavering courage. She began to wrap a fresh white bandage around his shoulder, her arm brushing against his chest. The simple, accidental contact sent a jolt through both of them. They froze for a heartbeat, the air suddenly thick with an unspoken awareness. It was the first time they had been truly alone, with no child to care for, no town to escape, no immediate threat looming over them. In the quiet of the canyon, another kind of danger, one of the heart, made itself known. He could smell the faint scent of soap and herbs that clung to her, a scent of clean and simple things. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the solid, living strength of him. She pulled back slightly, her face flushing in the firelight. She fumbled with the end of the bandage, her usual dexterity deserting her. She looked down at her hands, then slowly, hesitantly, lifted her eyes to meet his. His gaze was steady, intense, and filled with a question she did not know how to answer. The promise she had made to her mother felt like a shield, but a shield that was suddenly very thin. All the fear she had held at bay, fear of the law, of Pike, of the violence, seemed to coalesce into this one, deeply personal fear. She took a small, shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper, a mix of awkward humor and profound sincerity. "Still a virgin? Cowboy," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Do not scare me." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and intensely honest. It was a plea, a warning, and a laying bare of the very core of her principles. Ashki's expression did not change for a long moment. He simply looked at her, truly seeing the woman who had faced down so much, who was now admitting to this one last, fiercely guarded vulnerability. Then, the corners of his mouth lifted in a smile. Not the fleeting ghost of one she had seen before, but a genuine, warm smile that transformed his stoic face and made his flinty eyes soften. He slowly raised his good hand, not to her, but to his own chest, placing it flat over his heart. The gesture was one of absolute sincerity. "Then I will be your patient forever," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. The words were not what she had expected. They were not a promise of passion or a declaration of immediate intent. They were something deeper, something far more profound. They were a promise of patience, a promise of respect, a promise to wait, to care for, to protect, not just her body, but the principles she held so dear. It meant he understood that love, for them, would be a form of healing, a slow and careful mending. Tears pricked at the corners of Camilla's eyes, tears of relief and a sudden, overwhelming sense of being understood in a way she had never thought possible. He reached out then, his calloused fingers gently touching the tarnished silver bracelet that now hung from a leather cord around her neck. It was Little Sparrow's. He had given it to her for safekeeping, an unspoken trust. The firelight glinted off the delicate patterns, and for a moment, the reflection danced in her eyes. It was a contract made without words, a bond sealed by shared loss and a shared commitment to justice, his past and her future, intertwined in a single piece of silver. "I do not need a promise of forever," she said, finding her voice again. She put her hand over his, her fingers pressing the bracelet into her own skin. "I need someone who stays when the bleeding has not stopped." He nodded, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. It was a definition of love he understood. It was the law of his own people, to care for one's kin, to defend one's family, to stay no matter the cost. The warmth of the moment held them, a perfect, quiet peace. But Ashki knew he had to offer her the same honesty she had given him. He let go of her hand, his expression growing serious again. "This path we are on," he began, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "It is a hard one. When I started, I did not think I would see the end of it. I still do not know if I will." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sad truth. "I may not live to see the kind of peace you are looking for, Camila." It was not a plea for sympathy, but a stark and honest assessment of their reality. He was a wanted man, a warrior standing against a tide of money and guns. The odds were not in his favor. The seed of a future tragedy was planted in that moment of intimacy, a recognition that their story might not have a happy ending. Camilla felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She looked at this man, at his quiet strength, his unwavering purpose, his unexpected tenderness. The woman who had been so afraid of being tied down, of losing herself in another person, felt a fierce and sudden certainty. She had found something worth binding herself to, not a man, but a cause, a principle, a fight for what was right, and the man was the heart of it. "Then I will tell the truth for both of us," she vowed, her voice filled with a strength she had not known she possessed. "Even if I have to do it alone." Just as she spoke, a sound cut through the canyon's deep silence. It was faint at first, thin and reedy, a sound utterly alien to the natural world. It grew stronger, a high, mournful call echoing off the stone walls. A bugle. Ashki was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, all trace of the patient gone, the warrior fully present. He moved to the edge of their camp, peering out of the canyon mouth toward the distant plains. He did not need to say anything. Camilla saw it too, on the far horizon. Under the cold light of the moon, a great cloud of dust was rising, a pale, ghostly plume moving steadily toward the valley. Harrow was on the march. The army was coming. Their sanctuary was about to be invaded, and their moment of peace was over. The trial, if it could be called such a thing, was held in the town hall, a stuffy room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and fear. It was not a court of law, but a stage for a pre-written play. Lieutenant Harrow sat behind the main desk, his uniform crisp, his face a mask of judicial authority. The jury was a collection of Amon Pike's most loyal cronies, men whose paychecks depended on his goodwill. The room was packed with the divided soul of San Amaro, a tense, sweating mass of humanity murmuring and shifting in the oppressive heat. Farmers whose crops were failing stood beside miners whose loyalty was to Pike. Families Camilla had healed stood shoulder to shoulder with those who saw her as a traitor. Camilla stood before them, not in chains, but a captive nonetheless. She felt 1,000 eyes on her, some sympathetic, most hostile. Hyde conducted the questioning, his voice a dry rasp that methodically twisted every act of compassion into a crime. He painted a picture of a deceitful woman, a conspirator who had abandoned her own people to aid a band of savages. "Did you, or did you not, flee this town in the company of the wanted Navajo fugitive, Ashki Nez?" he asked, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "I left to care for a sick child," Camilla answered, her voice clear and steady, refusing to be cowed. A life was at stake. A life, Hyde scoffed. "You abandoned your duty to this community, to your own kind, for them. You stole private property, a ledger belonging to Mr. Pike. The ledger was evidence of murder, Camilla countered, her gaze sweeping over the jury, over Pike, who sat in the front row looking entirely unconcerned. Evidence that Mr. Pike paid men to attack a train and blame the Navajo people for it. A roar went through the crowd. Harrow slammed his gavel on the desk. Order the ledger in question, which was placed in the care of the church, has unfortunately been misplaced. It is stolen property, and therefore inadmissible. A gasp went through the room. Father Thomas, standing near the back, stepped forward. It was not misplaced. Lieutenant, it was stolen from my vestry last night. His eyes were like burning coals fixed on Harrow. But it did not matter. The official word had been spoken. The evidence was gone. Then they called their star witness. Don Mateo shuffled to the front of the room, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He would not look at Camilla. He placed a trembling hand on the Bible and swore the oath, the words a hollow mockery. Hyde's questions were gentle, leading. Don Mateo, you have known Miss Alvarez her entire life, have you not? You are her godfather. Yes, he mumbled. Tell the court, in your own words, about her character, about her association with the native fugitive. Don Mateo began to speak, his voice weak and reedy. He spun a tale of a good girl who had become confused, who had been manipulated by a dangerous and cunning man. He claimed she had confessed to him that Ashki had filled her head with lies about Pike and the railroad. Every word was a dagger in Camilla's heart, a careful and cowardly assassination of her character. The jury listened, their faces set in grim, predetermined lines. She was losing. The truth was being buried under a mountain of lies, and she was being buried with it. She could see the verdict in their eyes, guilty. But the laws of man are not the only laws that govern the desert. As Don Mateo finished his testimony, a sudden darkness fell over the room. The cheerful afternoon light vanished, replaced by an eerie, yellow gloom. A low moan began in the distance, a sound that grew steadily into a deep, guttural roar. The wind. It slammed against the town hall with the force of a physical blow, rattling the windows in their frames. A pane of glass shattered, and a spray of sand and dust shot into the room. Panic erupted. The sandstorm, larger and more violent than any they had seen that season, was upon them. The proceedings dissolved into chaos. People shouted, scrambling to secure the doors and windows, their legal drama forgotten in the face of nature's raw fury. In the swirling confusion, Ashki moved. He and a small band of young warriors had been waiting on the outskirts of town. The storm was the signal, the cover they needed. They raced to a small, isolated corral behind the cavalry barracks, a place where Harrow had imprisoned a dozen Navajo women and children as a form of insurance. The two guards, blinded and choking on the dust, were easily overcome. Ashki cut the ropes on the gate and led his people out, disappearing back into the roaring, red blindness of the storm. What had been a conflict with nature had become their salvation. Back in the town hall, the wind was a malevolent spirit, tearing at the building. It ripped a set of shutters from their hinges and blasted the room with a gale of sand. Eamon Pike, trying to shield his face, fumbled with the leather briefcase at his feet. A powerful gust tore it from his grasp, flinging it open and sending a flurry of papers cartwheeling through the air. People ducked and shielded their eyes from the paper storm within the sandstorm. One document, a thick piece of cardstock, fluttered down and landed at the feet of an old rancher named Jedediah, a man known for his stubborn honesty. He picked it up. It was a geological survey map of the Red Stream, the very map Pike had used to win over the council. But as Jedediah turned it over, he saw something on the back. It was a formal stamp of the United States Army Cavalry, and beneath it, the unmistakable signature of Lieutenant Harrow, authorizing the survey for official military use. Jedediah stared at it, his eyes widening. "What is this?" he boomed, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. He held the map high. "This is not a private survey. This is a military document. Pike and the army are in it together." The accusation, now backed by physical proof, shot through the crowd like lightning. The whispers and murmurs turned into an angry roar. At that exact moment, Father Thomas pushed his way to the front of the room. He held up a second ledger, one with a new, clean cover. "Lieutenant Harrow," he shouted, his voice filled with the wrath of a righteous man. "You may have stolen the evidence, but you cannot steal the truth. I sat up all night. I made a copy." The room exploded. The townsfolk, finally seeing the depth of the deception, turned on Pike and Harrow, their fear replaced by a furious sense of betrayal. The legal charade was over, shattered by a gust of wind and the conscience of a good man. In the midst of the pandemonium, Hyde moved with the deadly speed of a snake. The game was up, but he was a man who always finished his contract. He grabbed Camilla, yanking her arm behind her back and pressing the cold steel of a pistol barrel to her temple. The crowd fell back, their anger turning to shocked silence. "The original ledger," Hyde snarled, his eyes scanning the room, searching for Ashki, who he assumed must be nearby. "The ledger for the girl, bring it to me, or she dies using her as a shield." He began to back out of the room, dragging her with him into the raging storm. The news reached Ashki as he was leading the rescued families into the safety of the canyons. A young boy from the town, the baker's son, had run all the way, braving the storm to find him. Ashki listened, his face hardening into granite. He looked at the women and children huddled in the shelter of the rocks. He looked at the young warriors who looked to him for leadership. Harrow's troops were still out there, waiting for the storm to pass. His duty was here, to protect his people, to lead the defense of their home. But Camilla, he saw her face in his mind, her quiet strength, her fierce loyalty. He felt the phantom touch of her hands on his shoulder, healing him. He looked at Kla, the most promising of the young warriors, a boy who had the eyes of a leader. "The soldiers will come for the stream when the wind dies," Ashki said, his voice low and urgent. "Hold this pass. Do not let them through. If they cross the ridge, send the smoke signal. I will see it." Kla nodded, his face grave. "And you, Ashki?" Ashki's gaze turned toward the distant, blood-red cliffs of a canyon known to his people as a place of bad spirits and old battles. "I'm going to get her back." He swung himself onto Smoke's back and turned his horse away from his people, away from his duty as a leader, and rode alone into the howling heart of the storm. A short time later, one of Hyde's men found him, a proposition delivered under a flag of truce. The exchange would take place at dawn. In the canyon the Mexicans called Canyon Sangre, the Canyon of Blood. The dawn broke cold and gray, the last of the sandstorm settling like a shroud over the land. Canyon Sangre was a jagged wound in the earth, its high walls the color of dried blood. Ashki rode Smoke to the mouth of the canyon and dismounted, leaving the horse hidden in a cluster of rocks. He carried only what he needed, a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, the knife at his belt, and the pistol tucked into his waistband, its cylinder holding only 4 precious cartridges. Before he left his vantage point, he had laid a small, careful pile of dry brush on a high ledge overlooking the canyon entrance. A signal, prearranged with Kla and the handful of townsmen who had sworn to follow Father Thomas. The sound of a sustained firefight would be the trigger. He was one man, walking into the heart of his enemy's power, but he was not entirely alone. He moved into the canyon, a lone figure dwarfed by the towering cliffs. The air was still and heavy. He moved with the silence of a hunter, his feet making no sound on the sandy floor. Up ahead, the canyon widened into a natural amphitheater. He saw them there, on a wide ledge about 20 feet up the canyon wall. Hyde, Pike, and Lieutenant Harrow, and he saw her. Camilla was tied to a pinyon pine that grew precariously close to the edge of the ledge. Her hands were bound behind her, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. She was not weeping. She was watching, waiting, her spirit unbowed. Ashki did not try to hide. He walked into the center of the open space and stopped, looking up at them. 4 men, armed with rifles, were positioned on the cliffs above. A trap, plain and simple. "You came alone," Harrow called down, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "A foolish move. But then, your kind has never understood the principles of modern strategy." "I came as I was told," Ashki answered, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. Harrow laughed. A short, ugly sound. "You see, this is the beauty of civilized law. It sets the terms. It creates order. We told you where to come, and you came. We have the power, and you have obedience. That is the natural way of things." "A law that does not keep its promises is not order," Ashki said, his eyes as hard as the rock around them. He looked directly at Harrow. "It is just a hangman's rope, painted to look like a ribbon." The words struck home. A flicker of anger crossed Harrow's face. Eamon Pike, standing beside him, shifted impatiently. "Enough of this talk. The ledger. Indian. The original copy. Throw it up here, and we will release the woman." "Let her go first," Ashki countered. "Then you get the book." Hyde sneered, grabbing Camilla's arm and hauling her closer to the edge. The ground crumbled under her feet, and she cried out, "The woman is our guarantee. No book, no woman. It is a simple transaction." They were at an impasse. A deadly silence fell over the canyon. Camilla looked down at Ashki, then at the faces of her captors. She saw Pike's nervous, shifting eyes, the way he kept glancing at Hyde. He was afraid. He was not a soldier like Harrow or a killer like Hyde. He was a businessman, and his entire enterprise was about to crumble. She realized in that instant that they did not know about the copy. They thought the original was all that mattered. The truth was her only weapon. "The book will do you no good," she shouted, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, shattering the canyon's silence. "There is a copy. Father Thomas made a copy. It is sealed in the church for the whole town to see." The effect was instantaneous. Harrow swore, his face turning purple with rage, but it was Pike who truly broke. The carefully constructed composure of the powerful man dissolved into the raw panic of a cornered rat. The copy meant the truth was out. Unstoppable. The original ledger was no longer leverage. It was just evidence. And the man who knew the most about that evidence, the man he had paid to create and then retrieve it, was Hyde. A loose end. Pike's hand, which had been resting on the pistol at his belt, moved with a speed born of pure desperation. He drew the weapon, turned, and fired point blank into Hyde's chest. The Pinkerton detective staggered back, a look of utter shock on his face, before toppling over the edge of the ledge and plummeting to the canyon floor below. In that single shocking moment of betrayal, Ashki acted. He fired his own pistol, not at Pike or Harrow, but at the rifleman positioned directly above them. The man cried out and fell from his perch. Chaos erupted on the ledge. Ashki threw his rope, the loop expertly catching on a rocky outcrop near the pinyon tree. He began to climb, his powerful arms and legs finding purchase on the sheer rock face. Harrow, recovering from the shock, fired his pistol down at Ashki, the bullets ricocheting off the rock wall inches from his head. Ashki kept climbing. He reached the ledge just as Hyde, somehow still alive, was clawing his way back up, his face a mask of blood and fury. He lunged at Ashki, and the 2 men locked in a desperate struggle at the very lip of the precipice. They swayed back and forth, a tangle of limbs, their grunts and curses echoing through the canyon. During the struggle, the leather cord around Camilla's neck snapped. Little Sparrow's silver bracelet flew through the air, glinting in the morning sun before it disappeared into the dark chasm below. The sight of it, the last piece of his sister, falling into the abyss, made something in Ashki snap. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he shoved Hyde away from him. The detective lost his footing on the loose gravel, his arms flailing as he fell backward into the emptiness. His scream cut abruptly short. Ashki was free. But Harrow was now taking aim, not at him, but at Camilla. She was still tied to the tree. He was going to eliminate the last witness. But Ashki had used the last of his strength in the fight with Hyde. He was too far away to stop him. Seeing Harrow raise his pistol, Camilla did the only thing she could. She did not wait to be a victim. She threw herself to the ground, writhing and twisting, trying to reach the small utility knife she always kept tucked in her boot. Her fingers brushed against the handle, with a surge of adrenaline. She pulled it free. She could not reach the ropes on her hands, but she could see the thick rope binding her ankles to the base of the tree. She began to saw at it, the small blade biting into the coarse fibers. Just as Harrow leveled his pistol, a shot rang out from below. Jedediah, the old rancher, stood at the mouth of the canyon, a long rifle in his hands. He was followed by a flood of people, a makeshift army of angry townsmen and determined Navajo warriors, pouring into Canyon Sangre. The signal had been seen. The community had come. Harrow stared in disbelief. His moment of triumph turned to ashes. He fired one last, panicked shot, a wild, unaimed bullet in Camilla's direction. Ashki was already moving. He launched himself across the ledge, a human shield, pushing her flat against the ground as the bullet tore through the air where she had been. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of breath, as the bullet struck him high in the chest, the impact throwing him back against her. Below, the battle was short and decisive. The remaining riflemen, seeing they were outnumbered, threw down their weapons. Eamon Pike, his face a mask of terror, tried to scramble down a narrow trail to escape, but he was met at the bottom by a wall of his own miners, their faces hard and unforgiving. They seized him, their powerful hands gripping him like vices. Harrow, seeing it was all over, dropped his pistol and raised his hands in surrender. On the ledge, Camilla finally cut through the last of the rope around her ankles. She scrambled to Ashki, cradling his head in her lap. His eyes were open, filled with pain, but they were fixed on her. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across the front of his shirt. She ripped a long strip from her petticoat, a clean, white piece of linen, and pressed it hard against the wound, a desperate, futile attempt to hold his life inside him. The miners dragged Pike up to the ledge. One of them looked at the bound and bleeding man, then at Camilla, then at the strip of cloth in her hand. He took a fresh roll of medical bandage from the bag she had dropped, the same kind of bandage she had used to heal so many of them. With a grim and fitting sense of justice, they bound Eamon Pike's hands and feet with the tools of a healer, the symbol of her life's work used to restrain his violence. But Camilla saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to the space of the man lying in her arms. Ashki coughed, and a fleck of blood appeared on his lips. He was gurgling, drowning. She held him tighter, her tears falling freely now, mingling with the blood that was soaking the white cloth, staining it a deep, impossible red. The journey back from Canyon Sangre was a slow, agonizing procession, a river of grief and hope flowing through the desert. They carried Ashki on a makeshift litter, his body unnervingly still, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. Camilla walked beside him, her hand never leaving his, her fingers pressed to his wrist, searching for the thready, stubborn pulse that was the only anchor for her sanity. She had packed the wound with moss and bound it tight, a desperate field dressing against a mortal injury. With every step, with every jolt of the litter, she felt a fresh wave of terror, the promise they had made in the firelight, the vow of a patient and his healer, echoed in her mind. She leaned close to him, her own breath catching in a sob, and whispered into the stillness of his unconscious face, "Do not make me the widow of a promise." They brought him not to her old clinic, but to the church, laying him on a cot in the quiet coolness of the sacristy. There, with the Mother Superior and the baker's wife, Martha, as her assistants, Camilla began her true fight. She removed the bullet, a flattened piece of lead that had narrowly missed his heart, and for days and nights that blurred into one another, she was a fierce guardian at the gates of his life. She bathed his fevered skin, spooned broth and water between his pale lips, and changed the bandages, the white linen a stark symbol against his brown skin, a prayer made of cloth and herbs. While she fought for one life, the town of San Amaro fought for its soul. The arrival of a United States Marshal, a stern, weary man with eyes that had seen too much, signaled a shift. The makeshift justice of the frontier was replaced by the slow, grinding wheels of federal law. A circuit judge arrived a week later, and a proper trial was convened. The town hall, once the stage for Harrow's mockery of justice, now became a place where the truth, piece by piece, was brought into the light. Pike's ledgers, the original and Father Thomas's meticulous copy, were presented as evidence. Men who had once been too afraid to speak now stood and testified. Jedediah, the old rancher, recounted how Pike had falsified the military survey. Miners, their faces grim with the memory of their dead friend Samuel, spoke of the bribes and the intimidation. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Amon Pike, the man who had seen the land as his for the taking, was found guilty of conspiracy, bribery, and the illegal appropriation of land and resources. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. Lieutenant Harrow, stripped of his rank and his dignity, was taken into military custody to await a court-martial for his collusion and abuse of authority. The law of the land had, for once, bent toward justice. But a deeper justice was still needed. 2 weeks after the trial, the new town council met not in the hall, but under the wide-open sky. At the banks of the Red Stream, the Navajo were there, led by the young warrior Kla, his face bearing a new and solemn authority. They did not speak of vengeance or victory. They spoke of the water. They spoke of the future. That day, they drafted an agreement, a simple document written in both English and Spanish, guaranteeing that the Red Stream would be a shared resource, its waters to be used fairly by all who depended on it for life. The document was signed by every member of the council and marked with the thumbprints of the Navajo elders, a treaty of equals. A week later, the entire town, Anglo, Mexican, and Navajo, gathered in the small cemetery behind the church. It was a joint funeral for all who had fallen, for the miners killed in Pike's manufactured accidents, for the young warrior who had died in the canyon, and for the Navajo families who had perished in the raids. Father Thomas stood beside a Navajo elder, and they spoke of loss, of the terrible price of greed, and of the sacredness of every life. When the prayers were done, Camilla stepped forward. In the quiet that followed, her voice, clear and filled with a sorrow that was both personal and communal, read a single name into the wind. "Little Sparrow," she said. It was for Ashki, a final honoring of the quest that had started everything. As the last of the dirt was being laid, a figure moved to the front of the crowd. It was Don Mateo. He walked to where Camilla stood and knelt in the dust before her, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He did not ask for her forgiveness, but later that day, he signed over the deed to his saloon, the place where the first shot had been fired, to the town, with a stipulation that it be converted into a proper clinic and infirmary, a place for healing. Through all of it, Camilla's life remained centered on the quiet room in the church. Ashki's fever had broken, but he still lingered in the gray twilight between life and death. The silver bracelet, Little Sparrow's bracelet, was gone, lost to the canyon, but the bond it represented remained. One afternoon, as she sat beside him, holding his still hand, she felt a faint pressure, a weak but deliberate closing of his fingers around hers. She looked at his face, and his eyes were open, no longer clouded with fever, but clear and focused on her. She felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She leaned over him, her tears of grief now turning to tears of joy. She wanted to say 1,000 things, to tell him about the trial, the treaty, the funeral, but all the words caught in her throat. She simply held his hand, her heart too full to speak. He was terribly weak, his face gaunt, his body a shadow of its former strength, but he saw the tears on her face, and the faintest hint of his old, wry smile touched his lips, a line as thin and sharp as a knife's edge. His voice was a dry, hoarse whisper, barely audible. "I am still your patient," he said. In the weeks that followed, as his strength slowly returned, Camilla felt a profound shift within herself. The woman who had been so terrified of being bound, of a promise of forever, now found herself utterly and willingly committed. Her love for him was not a cage, as she had once feared, but an anchor. It was a responsibility she chose freely, a daily act of care that gave her life a purpose deeper than any she had ever known. There was no talk of a wedding, no need for a priest or a ring. Their vows had been made in a canyon, sealed in blood, and affirmed in the quiet moments of his recovery. She had matured beyond the girlish fear of being possessed into a woman's understanding that true freedom was found in binding oneself to what truly mattered. One evening, when Ashki was strong enough to sit in a chair outside in the cool desert air, they watched the distant train as it snaked its way across the plains, a line of black smoke trailing against the vibrant orange of the sunset. The iron rails, once a symbol of an unstoppable and destructive force, still crossed the land. The world of men and their machines had not gone away, but something fundamental had changed. The train passed, its whistle a lonely cry in the vastness, but they both knew its wheels no longer rolled over the rights of a people, and its great thirst would no longer drain their lifeblood. The steel still moved, but it moved now through a world they had helped to mend. The seasons turned, and the raw wounds of San Amaro began to scar over, healing into something new and stronger. The saloon, once a place of violent confrontation, was reborn. Its swinging doors were replaced by a sturdy oak door, and a new wooden sign was hung above it, the letters carved with care. On it, 2 lines of text were etched, one above the other. The first read, "San Amaro Community Clinic." The second, in the flowing script of the Navajo language, said the same. It was the first truly bilingual sign in the territory, a quiet declaration that the town no longer belonged to just one people. Inside, the long bar had been ripped out, replaced with clean white cabinets filled with jars of herbs and medical supplies. Where men had once gambled and fought, there were now 3 clean cots, always ready. Don Mateo, his face aged by a grief that had settled deep into his bones, worked there most days, sweeping the floors and stacking linens. His silence a constant, living apology. The townspeople came, hesitant at first, then with a growing trust. They came with fevers and broken bones, with the fears of childbirth and the pains of old age, and they were all treated, their language or the color of their skin no longer a barrier to care. Camilla and Ashki found their own peace, not in a church or before a judge, but in the simple, shared rhythms of their days. They did not marry. Their commitment was not a single event but a continuous action, a choice they remade with every sunrise. They lived together to care and learned together to heal. She taught him to read and write English from her father's worn medical books. His brow furrowed in concentration as he traced the strange shapes of the letters. He, in turn, taught her the language of the desert, the names of the plants that could soothe a fever or stop a bleeding, the way to read the clouds to foretell the rain. Their love was a daily practice of shared knowledge and mutual support, a quiet and steady tending to the life they were building together. Their legacy took root in the youngest generation, in a small classroom set up by Father Thomas in the back of the church. The children of the town and the children from the valley sat side by side on rough-hewn benches. A young Navajo woman taught them the stories of her people, and a Mexican woman taught them their letters and numbers. They learned more than just words. They learned how to build small, effective sand filters to purify water, a skill born from the hard-won treaty over the Red Stream. They learned to respect the land that sustained them all, a lesson paid for in blood. One spring afternoon, out in the pasture behind the church, Ashki's gray horse, Smoke, gave birth to twin foals, their long, wobbly legs a symbol of a fragile but determined new beginning, a promise of life continuing. But their bright future was not without its shadows. The bullet from Harrow's pistol had left a permanent mark on Ashki. The wound in his chest had healed, but the scar ran deep, a constant, aching reminder of how close he had come to the edge. The cold winter air settled in his lungs, making it hard for him to breathe. He could no longer run for miles as he once had, and some mornings, a profound weariness settled over him. They both lived with the quiet, unspoken knowledge that his life might not be a long one. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking truth that colored their days. He did not fear it. He had faced death and chosen life, and he chose now to live that life deeply, to savor every sunset, every shared meal, every quiet moment, with an intensity that made each day precious. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, they walked out onto the low sand dunes that overlooked the valley. The air was cool and carried the sweet, clean scent of desert grass after a recent rain. A gentle peace had settled over the land. Ashki sat on the warm sand, leaning back on his hands, a quiet contentment on his face. Camilla sat beside him, her medical bag at her side, a habit she never broke. She turned to him, her expression a familiar mix of professional concern and deep affection. "Let me listen," she said softly. It was a ritual they had, a quiet moment of connection that was both a medical check and an act of love. He nodded, and she placed the cold bell of her stethoscope against his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, a sound that was more precious to her than any music. She closed her eyes, concentrating, a small, serene smile on her lips. The heart was strong, damaged, yes, but strong. Ashki watched her, his eyes filled with a warm and gentle humor. The setting sun cast a golden light on her face, illuminating the strength and compassion that he had come to cherish above all else. He reached up with one hand and gently touched her cheek. She opened her eyes, and he smiled. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice a low, playful rumble. "Your patient is still alive." In the distance, from the direction of the valley, they could hear the faint, melodic sound of a Navajo song, a timeless chant of gratitude for the beauty of the earth. And from the town behind them, the soft, resonant toll of the evening bell from the church began to ring, its notes not clashing with the song but weaving through it, creating a new and harmonious sound, a peaceful anthem for a town that was finally learning to be whole. The wind carried the scent of sweetgrass, a strip of white bandage, forgotten on a fence post, fluttered in the breeze. The healing was not over. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video. And press the hype button to help this story reach more people.